I'm Maria Mexi, and I'm a research fellow at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And I'm here today with Katja Hujo, who is Senior Research Coordinator at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD. And with UNRISD, we are working very closely on the topic of just transitions. We had a very constructive workshop today discussing how we can engage young people in just transitions, in shaping just transitions, in developing ways to make just transitions fairer and more equitable. Thank you a lot, of course, for the strong collaboration that we have with your organization. And you recently published a very interesting report, a flagship report actually, discussing the issue of inequalities, but also addressing specific elements in relation to a new social contract and how we can build synergies in order to achieve social and environmental justice. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on these concepts and ideas and tell us a bit more about the report and how youth transitions and just transitions actually play out in this context?
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria. Thank you also to the Albert Hirschman Institute for this interesting workshop today. And I think that the topic of today's workshop really resonates very well with the research that we present in the flagship report, Crises of Inequality, Shifting Power Towards a New Ecosocial Contract. The report makes one key argument that inequalities and crises are closely linked. Inequalities are drivers of crises, of multiple crises, economic, political, climate, care, and the COVID pandemic as well. And at the same time, in each crisis, we see that inequalities are rising further.
So crises generate more inequalities.
Exactly, and that is also something that deeply affects young people. Mm-hmm. And we have seen it very clearly in the COVID crisis, where young people were disproportionately affected through labor market impacts, through educational impacts, through impacts on childcare and care services, and of course also through the political impacts and the general impacts on fiscal policy and austerity and so on. We know that also from the financial crisis in 2008 that youth tends to lose out in crisis situations. So that is one important aspect. And the other aspect that we highlight in the report is that if we want to move forward with the Sustainable Development Goals, if we want to have just transitions to more sustainable futures, we need to address inequalities. Inequalities are really a cross-cutting issue in sustainable development. And we are happy that the international community has included a goal, an SDG, on reducing inequalities within and between countries.
That's a specific goal, right?
Exactly. SDG 10 was quite a revolution because before the MDGs focused a lot on poverty reduction, but with the Sustainable Development Goals, for the first time in the history of the UN, a goal was established on reducing inequalities. However, this goal and the agenda per se does not focus very much at income concentration on the top. Mm-hmm. It is still a focus on the bottom 40% of the population, on shared prosperity, on trying to reduce income and wealth inequalities, but really with a focus on looking at the lower income classes. And what we say in the report is that it's really important to look at the wealth and income concentration at the top, because this extreme inequality that we have seen over the last decades, and much of which has been driven by neoliberal hyperglobalization has very serious implications for governance, for political decision making, for participation, for influence of elites on the political process, on our democracies, but also on sustainable development, on poverty reduction, for example, on health and educational outcomes.
And I guess in terms of access and opportunities for people, and especially for marginalized groups.
Exactly. So both the inequalities and also the crises that are produced through this increasing polarization has detrimental effects, especially for vulnerable groups. And again, we can look at all types of crises and find these patterns. For example, when we look at the climate crisis, we see that the richest people in the world and the richest countries in the world are responsible for the climate crisis, for the emissions. But on the other hand, the negative implications, natural disasters, global warming, droughts, etc., are mostly felt in the global south. And there also people have less means for adaptation and actually for countering these risks.
So the report addresses questions in relation to impacts, right? What could be the solutions to addressing inequalities? I mean, UNRISD has been working on inequalities, and you personally, for many years, several years now. Is that correct? I think.
Yes, we have always worked on inequalities. It's a cross-cutting issue for all the work that we do, because we are convinced that addressing inequalities is a key step towards sustainable development, towards economic, social and environmental justice. And we actually present quite a lot of solutions and pathways forward in the report after, quite an extensive analysis of intersecting inequalities, of how political, economic, social inequalities come together, how economic inequalities are reflected then in political inequalities.
And I guess how they play out in different regions.
How they play out in different regions and how they play out for different groups. And generations as well, exactly. And then we have also a discussion on how to overcome these challenges. And one concept that we propose is to build a new ecosocial contract. I don't know whether you remember that the Secretary General said in 2018 already, our social contract is broken.
Yes, definitely.
And many other actors have repeated that and have taken up this observation. So there is an increasing awareness that the rules that guide our societies, the norms and values, are undermined, are unraveling, and that people losing trust in the system, that they're not satisfied with the outcomes. And this is why we suggest actually to rethink our social contracts and to see whether they have fallen short in the past. And what we have identified is that there are a couple of relationships. Social contracts are about relationships between states and citizens, between people and nature, between men and women, between different countries, between business and labor. And many of these relationships have become very unbalanced and reflecting really power asymmetries that we have to overcome. Because the normative principle of a social contract is an agreement between equals.
Exactly.
But in the real world, we are not having actually that agreement between equals. So what we suggest is basically to have a discussion, a broad social debate about new ecosocial contracts that improve relationships between states and citizens, but also in the world of work, regarding gender justice, regarding human rights, regarding the multilateral system as well, but also addressing, for example, historical injustices, which has much to do with particular social groups that have been discriminated and exploited in the past, but also has to do with North-South relationships.
So you are actually pushing for a big normative change, right? Changing mindsets, changing mentalities. What would that require in relation to policy change?
That's a very good question, and I think the ecosocial contract concept allows for a framing of the political processes and the debates about norms and values and principles that we need. Once we have a kind of a consensus or a compromise around these principles and values, we have to put them into practice. We have to actually reform our policies, our economic policies, environmental policies, our political governance, our social policies, the way that we design global governance to actually implement these principles. And again, we have a proposal for that. We have discussed in the report several alternative approaches or progressive approaches that can lead us towards more sustainable pathways. For example, we discuss alternative economic approaches that embed the economy better into the natural environment, into societies. We talk about universal and transformative social policies that have a strong emphasis on care policies, but also on social services, on inclusive labor market policies. And we have a proposal for the reform of global governance systems to reinvigorate multilateralism and give a greater voice to civil society and to global South actors. And all of that in a spirit of strengthened solidarities. Mm-hmm. And I think that was also something that we discussed today at the workshop.
Exactly. And if I would ask you, what is the most important requirement in terms of implementing those changes? Is it political will? Is it some kind of different allocation of resources, decision making related? I mean, what do you think is the biggest requirement for a new social and ecological control, right? And somehow building the foundations for social and environmental justice. Would that be political will, the first priority?
Actually, that is emerging. We often say that we need political will. I completely agree. On the other hand, I have to say we have already a global agreement that member states have signed up to, and this is the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. Governments have actually committed to implementing the goal, and through this global compact, global ecosocial compact, they have expressed their political will. Now, I think if we still bemoaning a lack of political will, this really calls on all actors, especially at the national level, to hold their governments to account on these commitments. Of course, it always makes a difference if we have political leaders who really take a lead, who take it seriously, who make the changes that are necessary.
And in a certain period of time, because
exactly
require urgent action.
Exactly. There's also urgency. And there's also really a demand coming from civil society, but also just in terms of the context we are in, there is an urgency to act. So yes, we need political will. We need also progressive, committed leaders. But what is also very important is that we need an engaged civil society. And I think that including youth and giving more voice to young actors is very crucial there. The just transition debate that we had today, we talked a lot about actors, about trade unions, for example, who have a very important role to play, but also about alliances between organized interest groups like trade unions and social movements like the climate movement and young persons movements and so on and so forth. So usually what we say is, in the ideal case, change happens when we have progressive leaders, when we have engaged civil society that holds governments to account, but also actively participates and provides solutions. And we don't have to forget, of course, the corporate sector, which is extremely important in terms of, being innovative in production systems, in technologies, but also really buying and endorsing a social compact where, you know, you share prosperity with workers and with the broader population. So that is all very important, but I think we also have to take very decisive action to curb that extreme income and wealth concentration that we're seeing. And again, you know, that's not easy. And there are a lot of policies that can be enacted, but we need to act at national level and also at global level. Tax reform is extremely important. And also, you know, a lot of other reforms can address inequalities successfully. In the report, we have a range of options from, you know, legal reforms to fiscal policies, to social policies, to agricultural policies, urban policies. A lot can be done. It's a cross-cutting issue.
How can we find the report? Download it from the website of UNRISD?
Absolutely. It is on our website, Crisis of Inequality, Shifting Power for a New Ecosocial Contract, on the website of UNRISD, United Nations Research Institute for Social Development.
Thank you so much for this insightful discussion and also for the strong collaboration that UNRISD has with our center. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maria.